Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 62nd video in our Master Series, the 32nd video in our first phase processing, and the first video on compression and expansion. So this is a real simple process for me. The first thing I want to get across is that we didn't talk about these tools when we were doing flow editing because I normally do real detailed work. But as you get better at using compressors and expanders and things like that, they are great tools to help you in flow editing when you don't have to be that precise to just try to do some of the work we were talking about. So, for the most part, that I don't use them for a lot of detailed work because it's got some simple uses for me and that we're going to talk about. So the other thing I wanted to say is that there's a couple videos on my channel about compressors and expanders so you can understand their usage. So take a look at those. And also that for me, that this is after I've done all my sound sculpting, reverberation, equalization work, and all that kind of stuff because I might need to clean things up. A pretty good example of that is, let's say that I've got this piece of audio and this is what it looks like after I got done editing. By the time I get done with all my processing, it's looking more like this. It looks a little different and it sounds a little different. And you have to really take into consideration when you're doing this that you don't want to ruin the processing you've done up to this point, but you want to clean it up. So, and then one other point to keep in mind is that when we get done with this production or we get done first phase processing, I'm going to put a maximizer on the track to maximize the sound and to do my dynamics work for that entire track. But when I'm doing this work with the compression, that I'm dealing with individual areas. This individual area has a different dynamic range. Same with this area, same with this area. Does that make sense? They're at different levels that it could be a verse or a chorus or a break or a transition or anything like that. And I cut them and deal with them separately when I'm doing this because overall I'm going to use a maximizer on it, to get the dynamics of the entire performance set the way I want. So that's a huge thing to keep in mind. So the first thing, I'm going to try to make this quick as possible, is that whenever I'm doing my compression at this point, dynamics, gating, something like that, it's like I don't use gating a lot. By now, that it's very rarely I'm going to use one because at some certain decibel level, I want the gate to crush all sound beneath that. And, it has a use, but that's my basic function that I use it for. So, and I think there's a video on gating on my channel also. So when I'm going to do my compression, is that the first thing I'm looking for is to get transients. So if I've gone through there and I've got this set up to where, I've got a couple transients now. So let's say I've got this transient here, maybe a little bit here. I want to knock those down a little bit. Maybe this is kind of going to the transient area also. And so I'm basically going to bring this threshold up to where I'm seeing it right about there. And I want to knock just a little bit off of that, bring that down a little bit. And then I'm going to use a pretty hard knee most of the time, and then I'm just going to bring the ratio down on it, listen to it, render it and see what it looks like to make sure it's not affecting other stuff, and then unrender it and adjust back and forth, back and forth. So it's a real simple concept. After I've done that, the other thing that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to maybe possibly level the audio out again a little bit, because if you look at the difference between this track after my processing and this one, you can see quite a bit of difference in the audio levels and it going around, which is probably might have fussed a little bit with my flow editing stuff. So I'm going to go back in there again into level audio. And let's say I want things fairly getting close to this level around here. I want to get close to that level. So I'll figure out about where that level is, loop it, look at my meters, and let's say it's about there. Then I'm going to put a really soft knee on there so it compresses down on it like that rather than bam hitting it. And I'm going to bring a ratio down onto it, again, listening to it, and then render it and see what it looks like, see if it's doing that, unrender it, go through it again and fuss with it until I get it set to where I want it. And I'm just doing some audio leveling. The only other thing I would be doing is compression of the actual dynamic range compression. So dynamic range compression, a real, extreme version of that is if I put my knee on there hard and I bring my threshold all the way down there, and I start bringing this ratio down on top of it, that what's going to happen is it's going to start compressing the upper range stuff closer to the lower range stuff, bringing that closer. That can be do two things. First of all, it can enrich the sound and bring some of the lower harmonics up, the lower level harmonics, closer to the level of the upper end harmonics and enrich the sound, which is a great thing for dynamic compression. The problem is that a lot of times it can bring noise floor up, saturation, low decibel saturation, upper end hiss at low levels, low end rumble stuff that's, that you don't want up in there. So most of the time you want to get that threshold set somewhere to where it's not trying to compress stuff you don't want, together, and reduce the dynamic range of that. So it's a real simple concept. All these other parameters that they're going to be very situationally set to whatever you're working on, whether it's a kick drum or a snare or an oboe or a vocalist or anything like that, that you need to really understand what's happening there. There's a couple videos on my channel to really understand why that. Once you understand what those parameters are doing, it becomes pretty obvious. You understand ADSR and things like that of why you'd want to change those for what's going on. And we're not talking, you don't start causing audio pumping, clipping the audio where you don't want it to, cutting it off, all kinds of stupid stuff that, it's pretty basic, but we're not going to get into it because these parameters are pretty obvious in nature once you understand the parameters themselves. So go back and watch that video on compressors and expanders. And that's basically about it. I've dealt with my transients, any leveling of the audio that I need to revisit that. If I want to compress the dynamic range a little bit to color the sound, to, bring up a little bit of the other harmonics and some of the sound sculpting I've done, and reduce that dynamic range to make it sound a little fuller and wider and richer, that's a great tool. Just be careful with it. Now, when I start talking about expanders, upwards expanders, and upwards compressors and things like that, I don't use these a lot because if I get into an expander, that basically what am I trying to do? For the most part, most of the time, I am trying to reduce. I've got some level to where below that level here, I want to try to expand the dynamic range to push everything below that level down some so it's not as audible. And so basically, for the most part, with all due respect, that's about all I use expander for. I don't fuss with it, any other hybrid uses of it. That's what I use it for, to try to reduce, to increase dynamic range. And most of the time, I'm just trying to push stuff in the lower decibel range that I don't want in there. Like I've got upper end harmonic content, hiss kind of stuff, rumble, saturation, noise floor. I want to push that down, but not like a gate. I don't want to just squish it. I want to push it down some, so I expand the dynamic range, and that stuff goes way down, and it gets lower in the audible range where it's not as obvious. So that's very simple. And also, if you're going to use upwards compressors and upwards expanders, you need to really experiment with these, because these can be great sound sculpting tools, but if you really don't know what they're doing, that they can cause you a mess. You really need to get out your analyzers so you can see this in real time changing, on some kind of a piece of software. I've got a couple of them, so they do have them, and on your spectrum analyzer to really loop it and see what's happening besides just hearing it, because it's very important when dealing with these. But sometimes you might want to push up the lower end. You've got a prime example is I've got this guitar that the lower end, the stuff down below here is nice sounding stuff, but it's too loud, so I want to compress the dynamic range, bring that up a little bit. I'm compressing the dynamic range between here and here, and I'm want so it adds some ridges to it, and it's bringing those things up. The problem is it can start bringing up noise, saturation, all that other stuff we talked about. So it's a very delicate tool. The same thing with upwards expansion is that you've got the initial harmonic on this sound, and the first three the first three harmonics off of it are great sound, and you want to bring them up a little bit. them a little bit louder. So you're expanding the dynamic range there. The other stuff will be a little bit quieter, but it's making those a little bit louder that is making the sound better. There can be lots of applications about with these tools, but they're very situational, and I find I use them not very often. It's very rare that I use these unless I get some really screwed up files from somebody, or I got some really weird situation. I'm just going, what the heck is that? Maybe I can fix that with upwards expansion or some upwards compression or something like that, because it's very rare I use them. But they're great tools. I love tools, so I know how to use them, and I do use them now and then. You know, I find a situation, yeah, an upwards expander would work great on that, or an upwards compressor would take care of that real easy. But once you get to where you're doing all the things we've done so far in this series really well and understand all the concepts we're talking about and using them really well, a tool like this can be very helpful. You'll find you go, wow, now I know with sound and understanding all this stuff that's going on that I can use this upwards compressor or this upwards expander to do this with the harmonic content and the sound, or whatever this situation that's going on, that'll do this really cool thing. So that just comes in time with experience, that tools like this can be very helpful, but I'm not really going to get into using them because at this point it's very unlikely that I'd be using them for much. So that basically takes care of that. I'm dealing any compression I'm doing or expansion. I might be using a gate on something like we talked about, and for that, for the most part, I'm done. And this, for the most part, would have been probably some tool I used when I was doing sound sculpting, if I thought it would have been very applicable there and not caused any audio issues. So I hope you enjoyed this video on dealing with cleaning up with a little bit of compression, so you can deal with a few transients you might have created, or leveling the audio that you might have screwed up while you were sound sculpting to get it to sound just the way you wanted it, and maybe compress the dynamic range a little bit on something to enrich it or make it sound richer and fuller. And I hope you enjoyed the video. In the next video, we will get into a little bit of dealing with ADSR and clarity. Peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.